by a 10-year-old. The content of one of them is quite intriguing. A cartoon from April 2001 that shows a plane flying into the Twin Towers and accuses Bush of responsibility for all kinds of things such as that. Perhaps the Secret Service had some inkling of what was to happen and were disturbed by that. I don't know. In any case, it was regarded as threats against the life of someone under the protection of the Secret Service. He was put on trial. Before his trial came to judgment, 9/11 happened. And he was told by his lawyer, plead guilty, plea bargain. You could be in prison for 20 years. You know, the current atmosphere is really bad. Take a guilty plea, you'll get 12 to 18 months. He got 5 years. 5 years for basically cartoons. Now, once he got out of prison, he was, in a fairly short period, decided to exile himself to Canada, immigrated to Canada, got into some, I think, minor trouble in a hotel or motel. The police were called, again, doesn't sound like anything serious, and found that he had a criminal record. Here's a guy who's been in jail for 5 years for threatening the current President of the United States. And so he has been for nearly a year and a half in an immigration detention center outside Montreal. Now, I just want to read to you a few statements from one of his lawyers. So these are obviously not unbiased statements, but one of his lawyers, one of the documents asking for reconsideration of his case by the Immigration Tribunal. The lawyer remarks that the tribunal was clearly biased and expressed this bias on several occasions during the hearing. This is clearly shown by the treatment given to an American psychiatric opinion produced by a doctor attached to the Secret Service, and a pre-sentencing report from the US which is full of falsehoods and wild exaggeration. And that is true. I've looked at the documents, and there was a lot of stuff generated against this man that is clearly false. The tribunal clearly does not understand the importance of freedom of expression, which is protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Section 2B and also in Article 1 of the American Bill of Rights. Mr. Milaskiewicz's opinions about the Bush family are protected expressions of opinion in the law of any democratic country, as was shown before the tribunal. It is a serious error in law for the tribunal to say that Mr. Milaskiewicz was found guilty of a serious non-political crime because of what he said about George Bush. The other accusations which were brought illegally cannot be considered to be a serious non-political crime. These are clearly a pretext for persecution. The tribunal shows biased reasoning on the nature of repression in the United States. The tribunal wrongly states that George Bush was fairly elected as president. I'm glad to see the lawyer bringing that up. It's clearly an error in law to consider that the caricatures of President Bush which were done by the applicant could be the subject of a criminal conviction in any reasonable democratic state. So there you have, I've called it a tragicomedy. There are elements of farce, but of course, as with these other perversions of due procedure, we have something that is significantly messing up somebody's life. Now I'm going to be saying, I want to conclude by saying something about the Toronto 18 case, and in particular the conviction of one of the Toronto 18 accused. I want to say a little bit about the recent conviction of Momin Khawaja on another terrorism charge. But I want first to say a little bit about the war in Afghanistan, and I'm going to have to compress this radically. The American international law expert Francis Boyle has written very lucidly about this and has concluded that the Bush Jr. administration's war against Afghanistan cannot be justified on either the facts, a paucity of which has been offered, or the law, either domestic or international. Rather, it is an illegal armed aggression that has created a humanitarian catastrophe for the 22 million people of Afghanistan and is promoting terrible regional instability. I think all of that is entirely as true now as it was when he wrote it in 2004. Now, with regard to the facts surrounding the invasion of Afghanistan. Some of these facts are geopolitical. It's important to understand that the United States enunciated in 1998 and passed as an act of Congress in 1999 something called the Silk Road Strategy Act, which defined American foreign policy goals in terms of access to energy resources across Asia and the blocking of competing powers' access to these same energy resources. There's some very, very lucid and brief treatment of this in two books by Michel Chossudovsky, one of them, America's War on Terror, published in 2005. Now, part of what emerges from these geopolitical considerations is that the United States, there's very good evidence for this, had negotiated with the Taliban for a pipeline from the Caspian oil resources across Afghanistan into Pakistan and perhaps to India, but certainly to the Arabian Sea. There's good evidence that when the Taliban in the spring of 2001 said, we don't think we're interested in this anymore, that the United States at a diplomatic meeting in Afghanistan in July 2001 made threats against the Taliban regime of a war that would overthrow them and that would begin at the very latest in mid-October 2001. Right? Now, in other words, the plans for overthrowing the Taliban had a lot to do with geopolitics by this evidence and nothing whatsoever to do with the attacks of September 11th. Now, I think it's worth remembering that for a very long time, anyone who brought up this geopolitical energy politics stuff was scoffed at. No, that's irrelevant, until June of this year, when a very distinguished Canadian petroleum economist produced a report for the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives. His name is John Foster. The report was A Pipeline Through a Troubled Land, Afghanistan, Canada, and the New Great Energy Game. This report came out on June 19th of 2008. And quite suddenly it was generally acknowledged that indeed a $7.6 billion Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India natural gas pipeline was indeed going to be constructed at American insistence in 2010. And further, that Canadian forces in Afghanistan would be assigned responsibility for protecting that section of the pipeline which passes through Kandahar province, which is where most of the Canadian casualties in the Afghan war have been suffered. Now, that was reported in the Globe and Mail on the 19th and 20th of June, 2008. In other words, what are we doing in Afghanistan? We are part of an occupation that has resulted from a flagrantly illegal act of aggression. Francis Boyle, by the way, goes into the details surrounding the absence of any evidence provided by anybody that the Taliban regime, even assuming that bin Laden were responsible for 9/11, which we know very well he couldn't have been, the absence of any evidence that the Taliban had foreknowledge or that bin Laden gave orders. Right? Do you remember the white paper that Secretary of State Powell said was going to be produced that never appeared? And then we had this mockery of a white paper published by the poodle Tony Blair, which the British press had a great deal of fun with because it was simply a tissue of confabulation and rumor. Now, this has some relevance to, I think, a genuinely troubling case. By the way, I think it needs to be said, there are several issues with regard to the war in Afghanistan. One, of course, is the suffering of Afghan civilians. If we are fighting a war in Canada that requires us to bring our entire force of, superannuated main battle Leopard tanks to Afghanistan, what exactly are we doing? Right? If our response to an improvised explosive device that kills young Canadians patrolling a road between two villages, let's say, is to call in American A-10 Warthog jets or other jets and drop depleted uranium munitions on the village